Hello, welcome to a brand new episode of It's Not That Simple. Today, I'm really excited about this show because we're talking about a topic that I think really pertains to most, if not all of us, and that is perfectionism. Now, data and research indicates that over the last few decades, the pressure to be perfect has risen dramatically, with people today reporting significantly higher expectations of themselves and feeling judged more and more harshly by others. There's also data and information that points to the fact that people have a lot of pressure to be perfect and be successful, and that leads, of course, to more and more burnout as well. We'll get into the numbers, we'll get into the science, and we'll do that with our star guest of the day. That's Dr. Thomas Curran, a leading expert on perfectionism and the author of the acclaimed book, The Perfection Trap. He's an associate professor of psychology at the London School of Economics, and he spent more than a decade really researching this phenomenon, particularly among young people, and how it impacts our mental health, productivity, and relationships as well. Thomas, fantastic to have you on the show. I could go on about your research and your accolades, but I really want to get into a lot of the work that you're doing now, continuing to explore a topic that I think has really exploded, especially in the age of social media. To kind of set the stage for us, though, and like we do with all of our guests, I wanted you to break down the topic of perfectionism and explain why it's not that simple.
Well, thank you for that introduction. Perfectionism is not that simple because the image of perfectionism that we often hold in our mind's eye when we think about the trait is the quintessential overstriver, somebody who's got excessively high standards and puts themselves through the ringer to try to achieve them. And whilst that's true, it's only half the story. So perfectionists do have high standards, but if it were just high standards alone, they wouldn't be a perfectionist. They might be someone who's conscientious, diligent, perseveres when things get tough, but not importantly a perfectionist. What makes a perfectionist is that underneath all of those high standards is a hell of a lot of insecurity. Insecurity about not being enough, not measuring up, not feeling like we matter in the world. And that insecurity is the fire that goes underneath those high standards. And it's the two together, the insecurities with the strivings, that make perfectionism.
As we kind of continue to set the scene here for our chat, I wanted to see if you had any good data that you could share that really explains how this issue is expanding and it's becoming more and more impactful for young generations, I'm guessing, especially.
Yes, absolutely. So, as I mentioned, those two components of perfectionism, the strivings and the concerns, we have actually got really good measures and metrics that tell us how they're changing among young people over time. We published a paper in 2019 which showed that high levels of striving, something called self-oriented perfectionism, so that's perfectionism that comes from within, high self-set goals and standards, they are increasing relatively modestly, but nevertheless from a very high baseline. And so young people are subscribing to much higher personal standards than perhaps they did in previous generations. But what's really interesting in that data and some new data that we've got coming out imminently is we're seeing a rapid rise in those concerns, those insecurities, right? So that's second part of perfectionism. Things like concern over mistakes, doubts about our actions, indecisiveness, these kind of what we call perfectionistic concerns are rising upwards of about 60% since the late 80s. And we're also seeing an accelerating trend of what's called socially prescribed perfectionism. So that's the perception that other people expect me to be perfect and they're waiting and they're watching to pounce when I've made a mistake. That is on an exponential trend upwards. We documented that in 2019. We've continued to follow up the data to the present day, and we're seeing, again, upwards of about 60% more socially prescribed perfectionism than we did in the late 80s. And that's huge. Like, that's rocketing up into the present day. And we think that's a cause for concern because those perfectionistic insecurities and concerns are very tightly correlated with mental health difficulties.
How much is that tied to social media and to the digital world as well, Thomas? Because I guess when I was growing up in the 80s, you know, I could care maybe what my family thought of me, what my immediate kind of circle of friends thought of me, but that was it, right? Now you expose your life to the world, so the world is constantly judging you. You see that, I'm sure, on a day-to-day basis with the students that you work with, and in the research you do as well.
Absolutely. Social media has just opened up the world of information and the world of metrics and personal evaluation to the world. It's global now, where, as you correctly mentioned, it was very localized when we were growing up. And even, you know, I came through my youth when Facebook was just emerging, and it used to be a tool really to share embarrassing photos from the night before with your college mates, right? As a way of cementing offline relationships. So it was a social network in the truest sense of the word. But today it's morphed into something very different, where once I would log on to Facebook worried about what somebody's tagged me in. Now young people worry about not getting attention, right? Not having any likes or shares or mentions when it comes to their content. And that's a huge shift in the way that we view ourselves. It's a huge shift in the way that we view ourselves in relation to other people, and the need for approval and validation that we've, I suppose, gathered from this social media experiment. And now we rely on other people's engagement, likes and mentions for our own self-esteem. I don't think there's any doubt that's had a massive impact on the levels of perfectionistic concerns that we're seeing rising among young people.
How much do you think it's connected as well to materialism, and especially in the Western world, right? When there's various different levels of perfection and trying to be perfect, and maybe we can get into that as well, because there's being the perfect professional, there's being the, you know, perfect son or daughter or father or mother or friend, or having the perfect lifestyle, right? There's so many different elements. So break it down for us, if you could, across these different areas, and then the materialism part of it with, like we said, the social media of showing off what you have and what you don't have, and getting that feedback and that positive reinforcement constantly.
Yeah, I mean, materialism has been around for many decades.
Right.
There's a lot of data showing that the materialistic goals of young people started to spike around the mid to late 80s, and have only really accelerated since. And obviously social media has completely blown that out of all proportion once more. So I don't think there's any doubt that needing to feel like we are putting forward our best face, that we have a perfect life and lifestyle that we live and lead, are definitely factors in perfectionism. But I do think that they've been there quite a while. I think what's new in the particular today's age is not necessarily showing what we have and the fancy trinkets that we've managed to acquire, but actually how we're able to market ourselves. Today in the modern world, we're entrepreneurs of ourselves. And so where materialism once was be showing off our cars and jewelry, today it's showing off how hard we can work, or how much we can hustle, or
Gotcha.
what we can build, right? And that's a very different type of showing off, if for want of a better word. It's no less difficult psychologically, because you're never going to be the perfect hustler, the perfect grinder. You're never going to get to the stage in your life where you'll feel content or enough if you're constantly chasing more and more and more. And it's one thing to chase more and more possessions. It's another thing to exploit yourself, to ask more of yourself, because that's where you can lead to things like burnout, hyperactivity, depression. These are the modern maladies, and perfectionism, I think, fits neatly amongst them.
That's a great kind of link into my next question, which would be about how perfectionist people might not always be the most successful, and why they're certainly not the happiest as well.
Yeah, and this is a paradox that you'll see writ large across society. So if you look at the amount of spending that's going on right now on self-optimization, of self-help and self-improvement, we're at record levels. It's never been more spending on these tools, on these books, on these courses, on these coaching sessions. Never in history. And yet at the same time, when you look at the mental health data, you see people have never been more miserable, never been more depressed, anxious, particularly in younger generations, never been more dissatisfied and disengaged from the workplace. So there's a quandary here that doesn't just exist within the mind of a perfectionist, but it exists within the mind of society at large, where you have a situation where you're pushing yourselves really hard to optimize and finding that you're becoming more and more miserable in the process. And I think the explanation for that is quite straightforward. When you're continually pushing yourself for more, there's never any room in that psychology for contentment. There's never any room to feel like we're enough in that moment. Growth, in other words, trying to grow ourselves, improve ourselves, can only really thrive when we feel like we lack something, when we feel like we're not good enough, when we feel like there are flaws and shortcomings in our existence that we must plug constantly. And so paradoxically, this pursuit of optimization actually creates the psychological conditions to make us feel more miserable, less innovative, less energetic, and less productive. And that's really the story of perfectionism in a nutshell.
Obviously, as adults, we've grown to establish our own criteria for what success is, and then a lot of it is passed on to the next generation, right? So let's say I'm a parent, and you've done a lot of work on this as well, and that's what I wanted to get into is, as a parent, how are their expectations, our expectations, impacting the perception that children then have of what perfectionism should be and how they deal with criticism and try to live with it and find balance in their own lives and in their own aspirations?
It's really tough. I mean, parenting is one of the hardest jobs you can possibly do. And as a new parent myself, look, the world we live in has moved on so much from our parents' generation, which was what Foucault called a disciplined society, right? There are prohibitions, duties, obligations, right? You had to do what your mother and father told you to do. And yes, that was quite suffocating, but at least you knew where you were. Today, we live in a bit of a different world where essentially we're driven by an excess of positivity, right? So an excess of opportunity, an excess of challenge, an excess of things that we could or can be. And parents are exceptionally good transmitters of those messages. It's captured in this concept of a meritocracy. It's captured in this concept of competitive striving to lift yourself above other people in schools and colleges and the workplace. And on the one hand, whilst it sounds exceptionally liberating, it goes back to this same point around, once you have an excess of possibility, then everything becomes impossible by definition, because possibility is a limitless sphere, right? There is no limit to what we can be or what we could do. So all we're doing by asking our children to keep striving, to keep doing more, to keep them lifted on their tiptoes all the time whenever they've done a test and got a good grade, instead of just allowing them to enjoy that, we're constantly pointing their compass in the direction of the next grade and the next grade and the next test and the next test, right? So we're constantly pushing them in a forward direction. And that pressure, that expectation, our research quite clearly shows is on the rise, number one. So young people are reporting excessive levels of expectation, or they feel like parents are excessively expectant. But number two, our research shows that those expectations are directly correlated with perceptions of perfectionism, particularly socially prescribed perfectionism, as I'm sure it won't be a surprise to hear. And so it's really, really not just a problem of young people in society, but also parents too are transmitting perfectionist tendencies.
I mean, there's so much to get into there. I guess parents obviously play a huge role, but then I guess the schools, the work environments. What kind of advice do you give, or can you give, looking at the data, where young people especially don't feel like they need to be perfect all the time? How do they demystify that?
Well, the first thing is to try to, as much as you can, pull yourself out of the societal fixation on more. The societal fixation on more is very easy to understand for a brute economic lens. we need to be captured in terms of our attention, our spending, and our working, because those are the things that drive economic activity and ultimately economic growth, which rises the level of prosperity. So on a pure economic perspective, we need to be continually pushing ourselves well beyond comfort in all sorts of spheres of our lives. But paradoxically, the data shows very clearly that you can do too much. You can work too hard. You can consume too much. You can work too much. And those things ultimately will not just have an impact on your mental health, but the outcomes you're purportedly striving for through higher levels of innovation, higher levels of burnout, and lower levels of productivity. So you really have to try as hard as you can to pull yourself away from all of these cultural fixations on more and more and more, and recognize that the great thinkers taught us something very important, and that's that contemplation, that allowing ourselves to sit alone in comfort with ourselves, to read, to listen, to think, that is exceptionally non-productive behavior in the short term, but incredibly productive behavior in the long term, because it allows us to absorb and to be in the world in a more intentional manner. And that's a message for parents, that's a message for children, that's a message for teachers. It's not an easy one to convey, but the research shows us that if we can stop being so fixated on fast and quicker and better, and we can slow down, paradoxically, we get more out of it.
When you talk about slowing down as well, there's this slowdown in the absorption of content that all of us, I think, struggle with, because we have a device in our pocket that will constantly entertain us, whether that's news, whether that's games, whether that's social media, whatever that may be. But I don't know how you are and what you say, but I consciously try to stop myself every time I've got 10 seconds without doing anything to reach for the phone, or if I'm at home, turn on the TV or watch something that I want to watch. How important is it to stop, to feel like you're bored again? Because nowadays it's difficult to be bored because there's always something there to entertain us and to distract us, right? So how important is boredom in all of this as well, and that nothingness that can be around us for a few minutes a day?
Well, obviously the societal message is that's the worst possible thing you could do, right? What could be worse than being bored? But actually, it's not the case. Distraction is everywhere. And I'm convinced, by the way, that mental health difficulties in this society are far higher than reported. The only reason we don't see them is because we're constantly distracted. We're pulled out of ourselves into hyper-real realities through social media or television screens that take us out of ourselves constantly. There's always a distraction there for us whenever we're feeling low. And it's taken me a while to realize that, and this isn't just an empirical point, this is a personal point too, that actually the more you can distance yourself from those distractions, the more you can be comfortable with that discomfort of just sitting by yourself, not doing anything, contemplating, thinking, sometimes difficult thoughts, right? Once you're on your own, intrusive thoughts will come in that aren't necessarily thoughts that you would like to sit with, but don't suppress them and avoid them. It's very important as human beings that we confront them head on. We think about them, we work them through to their logical endpoints. That's where self-compassion comes into our lives, when we can actually think through some of these catastrophization thoughts or worries or ruminative cognitions that we might have on a day-to-day basis. I think boredom and just sitting and doing nothing is just about the most productive thing you can do, both for your mental health and also your productivity at work.
In the interactions you have with students and in the work that you've done, the research you've done, what have you seen regarding the need to accept mistakes, to accept imperfection? I'm not saying necessarily celebrate those, but to realize that not everything needs to be perfect all the time.
And nothing can be made perfect either. That's the crucial thing to bear in mind. I think acceptance is a huge piece of the perfectionism puzzle. Perfectionists just cannot possibly accept anything less than perfection, and they will try with all their might to avoid the worst case scenario. And even the slight bump in the road, they'll also try to avoid that too, which makes them very failure averse, which makes them prone to things like procrastination and withdrawal from challenging activities, which, by the way, is one of the primary reasons why perfectionists struggle to perform. There's no relationship between perfectionism and performance whatsoever.
Really?
Absolutely, yeah. You look across the piece, and there's no relationship between perfectionism and performance, and that's the main one. They'll try to remove themselves from situations instead of meeting them head on, because the calculation in the mind is, well, if I tried now to control the situation, right, and it doesn't work out, then I've revealed publicly that I'm inadequate or insufficient or imperfect in this moment, right? So it's not worth it. It's not worth me taking that risk if I can't control it. And so they withdraw themselves from those activities and then push themselves into directions where they can control the outcomes more. So what you tend to see in the workplace is perfectionists do very low value activities. They'll spend their time doing like non-urgent emails, maybe writing meeting invites or booking rooms or things that just aren't really that important, but they know they can control them and do them well. So they default to those activities and remove themselves from really, important activities. Anything customer focused, I don't know, client reports, anything contractual, right? It's like really difficult to get your head around. They'll just avoid those tasks. They'll procrastinate and avoid those tasks like the plague. And of course, they're only damaged by the passage of time. They've got to get them done. And then the end product is compromised, right? So perfectionists have a real big problem with control. They need it badly, and allowing themselves to step back and just accept that sometimes things won't pan out the way we planned. And that what's more important is actually meeting the challenges head on, learning, developing, and making sure that if we do make a mistake, we put it right the next time. And part of that process is absolutely being able to accept that life isn't perfect, we're not perfect, and things will go wrong from time to time.
I need to ask you about AI, because if there's something that aims to be perfect, then it's obviously artificial intelligence. What have you noticed in your line of work regarding the impact that AI can have on what we produce, what we create, what we share? Because ultimately, in a way, you're giving control to someone else, in this case, AI, but you are controlling AI with the prompts that you use. So what have you noticed in that, with that phenomenon?
To be honest with you, like, AI is one of these topics that is all over the place. Wherever I go, I always get the question asked about AI. And part of me just wants to say, I just want to feel something. Like, I don't necessarily care too much about AI, because my main consideration in life is trying to feel the world around me, have the ground underneath my feet, like not get sucked into these developments that are hyper real. However, that said, there is obviously now a wave of AI that's coming. It's going to have a tremendous impact on our lives, particularly the lives of young people who are most exposed to its frontier. And there's an optimistic and a pessimistic view. The optimistic view, particularly for perfectionists, is that I was mentioning a moment ago, perfectionists default to those low-value tasks. Well, AI is going to take care of those low-value tasks. So human beings won't need to do them anymore, because they will be automated, which only leaves the high-value tasks. So for perfectionistic people and young people in general who do suffer with perfectionistic thoughts and behaviors in more regularity than older generations, this could be extremely liberating, right? It could give them permission now to focus all of their energies on those high-value tasks, provided they're in an environment and a context that gives them support, that gives them psychological safety, that says we trust your abilities, and if things go wrong, there's a safety net. It's not going to be the end of the world, right? So those messages are really important. So it could be a good thing, and it could supercharge productivity for people that struggle in that way. My worry, though, having taught students and having worked with young people, is that sometimes there is often an inclination to use AI as a substitute for knowledge and understanding. And that's where it becomes dangerous, because if we're leaning on AI to think for us, then it's like anything, garbage in, garbage out. There's no way that AI can help us fully understand a piece of code, a statistical analysis, a book or a philosophy if we haven't already read it first and understood it first. AI can come in after that fact and supercharge our ability. It can validate our assumptions. It can enlighten us on the things that we might have missed first time round, but it can't make up for a lack of basic and substantive knowledge. And so AI used sensibly and responsibly, I think, can really help young people be much more productive and to allay some of those perfectionistic fears. But it's really, really important that we encourage them to engage in the learning first and foremost, because without that, AI is useless.
All right. Before we get on to our quick fire questions, as we start to wrap up this conversation, I wanted to get your perspective on how you deal with people who do struggle with this. And I'm sure that you're asked about this all the time as well. And maybe even some students have told you, look, I'm struggling with this. How do I contain it? How do I teach myself to detach from this obligation, from this pressure? So if someone approaches you, or if anybody watching / listening to this right now, and they could be struggling with it, or they know someone who's struggling with it, how would you deconstruct it, or what kind of advice or kind of conversation should they have?
Well, absolutely. I get this question asked a lot, and one of the things that I respect as a social psychologist is boundaries, and I'm not a clinical psychologist. That's the first thing to say, and I know that disappoints a lot of people. But it's really important we have those boundaries, because there are many fabulous books written by clinical psychologists on perfectionism that will help you understand your perfectionism better and give you steps to overcome it. And so most of my work and most of the things that I've written about and talk about are mainly societal level issues, things that help us understand perfectionism as a societal affliction rather than an individual problem to fix. And I think that's really important on a therapeutic note. And the reason why I think that's important is because if we understand more about where our perfectionism is coming from, that most of it is rooted in the culture outside of us, it gives a broader context to these feelings, and it lets us recognize that this isn't my fault, that actually I'm supposed to think like this. My entire society revolves around my need to do more and have more and consume more, because without those things, we don't have an economy. So just that knowledge alone, I think, is incredibly therapeutic. Now, there are things that I will advise on a subclinical level, things that you might call psychoeducational tools that people can bring into their lives. I think the first thing that I often say to people who struggle with this is just try and microdose a little bit of discomfort into your life. That's going to be difficult at first for a perfectionist, but stick with it. And what I mean by that is just allow yourself to go into the world tomorrow and don't let perfectionism's facade impact the way you interact with other people. So don't fish for reassurance like you would do if you were a perfectionistic person, right? Is it okay? Is this good enough? Am I on the correct path? Just avoid those kinds of indecisive and reassurance-seeking types of language, and be more assertive. Just say, here's the report, or here's the presentation, or I'm going to go down this route for my essay. Have faith in yourself. Now, that's not going to be easy for a perfectionistic person because they're constantly questioning, right? But the more you can go into the world like that, the easier it becomes. That's like taking a sledgehammer to perfection.
I think that helps a lot. And I identified a lot of I think aspects of perfectionist behavior here, thinking about examples and cases in my life, and that example and that advice I think helps to at least start breaking that down and give a practical example of what can be done to start microdosing that discomfort, like you said. Let's get into our quick fire questions. So we've got 4 of them, and in one sentence, let's say. If you could try to answer these, that'd be great. So first of all what is one personality trait that you think a good leader could benefit from having, and why?
Empathy, because nobody is perfect. People will make mistakes, and the more empathetic you are, the more compassion you can show, and that will help your team.
That's very clear. What is the biggest challenge you think that humanity is facing today?
The big challenge is separating our need for growth from need for human flourishing. Those two things have become disconnected. We're too focused on growth. We're not focused enough on human thriving. And so that, I think, is the big challenge.
If I were going to give you a magic wand and you could change one thing around you, what would that be?
I would change the way that social media preys on young people in particular. I think I would be on the side of more regulation of social media companies, particularly when it comes to young people.
Love that. And finally, what is the most important learning of your life and career?
That we're just human, and everybody's imperfect. We're flawed human beings and creatures, and the more that we can accept that, the easier it is we'll treat ourselves, and the more kindness that we'll treat other people with too.
Thomas, it's been a pleasure to delve into this topic with you. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise, your insight, your experience, and your work throughout the last few decades, and continued success in everything you do, and keep helping us deconstruct and deal with this issue that definitely affects this generation, as we've discussed, which is perfectionism. Thank you.
Thank you.
Fantastic to have Thomas Curran on the show. I think he was clear regarding data that shows that we are more and more inclined to feel the pressure to be perfect. And I think he helped as well when it comes to giving some simple advice that could help all of those who could face this issue to deal with it. So it's been another great episode of It's Not That Simple. We'll see you soon.